Welcome, I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another video in the History of New Orleans series. We're back speaking with Anthony Stanonis about, not this time about something that he has already published, but about something that he's working on. And it is not the history of tourism, although it intersects with that. It is the history of pralines. I suppose we can put this in the broad category of sort of food histories, like the history of cod and the history of salt and things like that. Or, it sort of maybe ties in a bit with the kind of history of cotton in New Orleans that I've written on, except it sounds a lot more interesting and more tasty and more fun. So how on earth did you come across this topic?
I came across this topic because in my, obviously, my first book on the 20s and 30s, I know pralines were a major souvenir. And I've done work on foodways in the South, and I've continued to do work on New Orleans. And the more I dig through the various decades of New Orleans history, pralines keep popping up. And I also came to this topic because I most recently co-authored with my former PhD student, Rachel Wallace, a history of the king cake. And the king cake is associated with Mardi Gras. And I was interested in that because it's become post-Katrina a symbol of New Orleans. Right? The New Orleans Pelicans have a mascot that is the king cake baby. There is a minor league baseball team called the Baby Cakes. That was the Mardi Gras baby. And so I was curious about the history of the king cake. And so I sort of traced that out with Rachel and Wallace contributing as a co-author on that. And partly what I saw was the king cake very much represented, coming out of the Carnival cruise of Reconstruction, a white history of New Orleans. I have a few examples. You can see them.
I suspected you would.
There we go, right? These are called frozen charlottes. Based on a poem that was written in Maine, of all places, in the 1840s. But these little ceramic dolls were given to kids in the 19th century as toys. And in New Orleans, during Reconstruction, they would, at the culmination of the 12th Night Revelers crew, they would bake 12th Night cake, which is a European tradition. And it was a way of selecting the queens and the debutantes. If you got the golden bean, you become the queen, and the silver would be the court. And by the turn of the century, these started to be made at home. And so that's where you start to see the first mentions of frozen charlottes, little dolls being baked in the cake. And eventually that evolved into, by the 1950s, little plastic dolls, but as you can see, very white, which becomes controversial after the Civil Rights Movement. And people started, by the 1980s and 1990s, diversifying the color, or going completely neutral and going with green, or some bakeries have gone with animals, cars, representations of different cultural things, like a trumpet that's associated with New Orleans. So I was curious about the evolution of the king cake and why this became so popular post-Katrina, really as a way of tapping into the history of the city, and that sort of, we're timeless, we're going to preserve and rebuild. Right? And the king cake becomes this thing that everybody in New Orleans sort of rallies around, and it sort of loses some of that loses that racial meaning that was originally there in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what was curious about that is it replaces, in many ways, the praline. Right? Because the praline from the late 19th century up until the Civil Rights Movement and into the 1980s and 90s was the cornerstone of the souvenir trade in New Orleans. And it's still a big part of the industry. But the praline was always marketed with a mammy image. Right? And there's been some work by a graduate student at the University of New Orleans that looked at the history of the sort of mammy industry, and that the way we look at that is misinterpreted. That the mammy imagery in the late 19th century would be an African-American woman in her work gear going out and making a living. And that sort of got me thinking about how this plays out, because in the white imagination, it gets reimagined as the mammy, right? This loyal former slave who's devoted in New Orleans to her white Creole family. It's sort of a local twist on that southern view of the loyal mammy. The praline mammy becomes the mammy image in New Orleans and in a good part of the Louisiana. So I got interested in sort of looking at what was the history. This was a short piece that was written on praline sellers in the late 19th century all the way through. It was but it's a really good piece of work. And I thought, well, there's something more here that's worth digging through. And so looking at how African Americans used marketing in the streets. And if you look in the late 19th century, it's African American women selling all kinds of different sweets, right? and things. It's not necessarily just the praline. But by the turn of the century, it becomes the praline. And I was curious about that transition. And from what I'm seeing in the early 20th century is the rise of sort of businesses that are in the candy trade, muscling in on this very lucrative business as tourism develops. And they take the image of the Black working class woman selling on the street, tie it in with this image of the Southern mammy, and use it to market their products and muscle them out of the street trade, right? Co-opt them. Right? And soon what you see are those African American women being hired by white-run companies to market the mass-produced pralines that these companies are producing. So looking at this whole transition of the praline and what it means, because I'm also interested in the praline itself, right? Why is this brown sugar thing so much more important than the other things that, like there was coconut pralines that these African American women are selling in the late 19th century. There's all these different things that they're, using through the commercial trade in New Orleans, which has had all these cornucopia of food in these baskets that are described, and yet it's this brown sugar pecan-based thing that is promoted. And so I'm curious at the evolution of the sugar industry in Louisiana. Partly what's happening are the old plantations that have been the root of the Louisiana economy going back to the 1795 when they first start to figure out how to produce sugar, that they're being challenged by importations of cheap sugar from Cuba and recently acquired Hawaii, the Philippines. So the sugar industry is under threat in Louisiana. And because of modern technology, companies are able to refine sugar into pure white sugar. So the brown sugar becomes a symbol of the old-time Louisiana sugar plantation. And it also, because of the brown nature of that sugar, represents race. There's a long history of color of a food representing racial groups. We see that and it's pretty well documented. Zora Neale Hurston writes about this in her book on hoodoo, for instance, in New Orleans in the 1930s. Salt represented whites, black pepper represented African Americans. And so I was looking at this brown sugar in this white sugar world. What does that mean in New Orleans? And then I've been looking at the pecan. One of the, the things that really surprised me is the pecan is first domesticated by a slave on a plantation along the river outside of New Orleans. We know, where this was done. The name of the plantation is slipping my mind at the minute. But we know this slave was the first one to figure out grafting of pecan trees, because you can't really grow pecans from nuts because you don't get the consistency of the nut from generation to generation. You have to graft. And this horticultural expert on this plantation figured out this grafting technique, and it becomes the first domesticated pecan tree. It really becomes the basis of a whole New South industry of pecan cultivation, which in the late 19th, early 20th century Louisiana is at the core of creating this new industry of pecan orchards. And so I saw in the praline and how it becomes the focus. You see issues of race, you see issues of the economy, and you see how the image of the praline changes over time, right, within the city as a souvenir, and how it's marketed and how it's imagined. And right now I've got a few names of African Americans who continued to sell pralines in the streets up through the 1920s. I'm trying to trace them down and see what their histories are. When one of them dies in the 1920s, it's front page news. She goes missing and she's lost. She's gone out in the streets and she's gone missing, and it's front page news. Let's find her. And so there's like this real attachment to this image of the praline mammy, who's really a praline entrepreneur, right? And how it's imagined in the African American community, how it's imagined in the white community, and what this little seemingly insignificant little dainty sweet has to say about so much about the city's history.
That's great. I think that's a perfect example of how really imaginative, good cultural history and also food history takes something that just seems like something you buy to bring back with you to remember, well, for about a week until you eat them all, to remember your visit to New Orleans, and realize there's all this complex stuff there. I thought it was really interesting, the sugar sort of hearkening, the brown sugar hearkening back to the sort of ancient past. And the pecan, I wouldn't have thought of it, but the pecan is actually quite modern, you're suggesting there.
Yeah.
So it's in some ways a merger of the traditional and the new and everything as well.
Yeah, no, it's really, like the pecan. Well, this is where I got into your article about foraging. Right? Because, even though in the popular narratives that you see in the newspaper, right, there's all these attempts, there's a variety of different stories about how the praline showed up in New Orleans. Right? Now, the first image I have of a praline is from the 1890s in the newspaper. It's the late 1890s. And the first clear description of the praline as we know it today is 1890s. So, it's a strange, the story becomes, this goes back to France in the 1700s or the 1600s, and the Duke of Praline, right, his cook came up with it. And then it was over here in the colonial period. But if you actually start scratching through the sources, I don't really see anything. There's a few confectioners in New Orleans who are selling things that are called praline, and here we get into the terminology, but praline in the French sense of a generic chocolate-covered sort of almond, which is what the historic praline or praline was. And there's all this argument about how to pronounce it. What I've come across that's really fascinating is that in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, French Creoles actually call the praline plurine. They reverse the R and the L to separate it from the more generic praline. So basically, if it was a flat cake, right, it was a plurine, coming from the French flat. And that was the local terminology for this, and it died out as the French population died out. Although I still see a few references here and there. It'll pop up weirdly in like the French market. Some seller will be calling it a plurine, but it loses. There's a huge debate in the early, I think it was around 1910, about what should this thing actually be called. But yeah, it becomes the praline. Partly what I'm seeing is that everyone knows what a praline is because of the generic nature of that. And so and even the press says it becomes the way of calling it and identifying the flat pecan base, because that's what everyone knows from French class, that the other thing is just a local differentiator that gets lost in French class.
Yeah. Oh,
so yeah, you see this cultural transition from New Orleans being French-based as well to being a more Americanized, diverse community, and how the praline moves out of that French community into this modern New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, this is great. I see a time in a couple of years where every place where you can buy pralines or pralines or whatever they are in New Orleans has a copy of your book right next to it.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. You know, if I can keep on this thing, you know, if I can keep on it. But excellent. I do a little every day. I have my set hour. I sit down and force myself, chug away.
That's the way you get it done.
That's the way you get it done. So.
Thanks so much for telling us about this project, and we'll look forward to reading it once it's done, once it's finished.
Thank you for letting me talk about it.